This is our sixth video in our series on eschatology. If you've watched the previous videos, you know that we began speaking about the millennium, what the millennium is, and different Christian views of the relation of the millennium and the second coming of Christ. Talked a little bit about the premillennial view, the post-millennial view, and the millennial view. In this video, I actually want to talk a little bit about how my views on eschatology have changed over the years since I was younger. So growing up in a Christian home, I was raised with the viewpoint of dispensational premillennialism. In fact, this was the only viewpoint on eschatology that I was actually exposed to. I didn't even know that Christians disagreed on the area of eschatology. I just thought that this is what the Bible taught. So when I was young, I read a lot of books, prophecy, and the topic of eschatology always fascinated me. So I read books by Hal Lindsey and other popular dispensational authors. In the 90s, when I was a teenager, I would actually attend these prophecy conferences with my dad. And I grew up in a lot of, Calvary Chapel style churches. So we would attend these conferences where we would listen to speakers like Hal Lindsey, Chuck Missler, Dave Hunt, along with some Calvary Chapel speakers. If you're old enough to remember the 90s, you'll remember some of those names. I think everyone pretty much knows who Hal Lindsey is. But these were very, prominent prophecy experts during that time. And so we would go to these conferences and they would talk about current events and what's going on in Israel and how the events that we see around the world, could possibly usher in end time scenarios. Being raised in this sort of Calvary Chapel environment, if you've attended Calvary Chapels, you know that they tend to place quite a bit of emphasis on eschatology in general and the pre-tribulation rapture in particular. In fact, if you've read Chuck Smith's book, Calvary Chapel Distinctives, he actually has a chapter dedicated to the pre-tribulation rapture. Again, just underlying that emphasis on the fact that the pre-tribulation rapture is a distinctive of Calvary Chapel churches. Well, as I got a little bit older, not only was I exposed to different viewpoints on eschatology, but there are also a couple of events that I think caused me to become a little disillusioned with the dispensational interpretation or framework of Scripture. One of those was all of the events surrounding Y2K. So if you're old enough to remember Y2K, there were a lot of so-called prophecy experts who were saying that Y2K was going to usher in the last days and the rapture and the tribulation. One of the prominent speakers was Chuck Missler. And he came out with this, audio tape on Y2K, and a lot of churches sort of bought into this idea. In fact, I remember the church that I attended at the time, there was actually an individual who sold his house and bought an RV and drove to the mountains because they were so convinced that Y2K was just going to usher in the end times. And Y2K came and went, and there was not much about it. And then I just became very sort of, disillusioned with some of the so-called prophecy experts and how they could just continue on with their ministries. Like someone like Chuck Missler, for example, who was promoted by Calvary Chapel and other churches and would just sort of continue on with their ministry as if nothing had happened, when you have Christians who were seriously affected by their teachings and their claims of what was going to happen in the near future. So that caused me at one point to sort of question this whole dispensational interpretation and framework. I also began reading other books, reading other articles. I remember another sort of significant article that I read was this article by Greg Koukl, who's the president of Stand to Reason, which is a great apologetics organization. But Greg Koukl wrote this short article entitled "The Rap on the Rapture," and he's a very intelligent guy, someone I respect, and he lays out his case for why he does not believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. So as I begin to read more and kind of expose myself to other viewpoints, within Christian theology, I became less and less convinced of the dispensational premillennial interpretation of eschatology. Two books that I read actually that were influential on my own thinking were two books by Robert Gundry. One of them is called The Church in the Tribulation, and the other is called First the Antichrist. And if you've read Sam Storm's book, Kingdom Come, which is one of my favorite books on eschatology, it's interesting because Sam Storm's journey in eschatology actually is very similar to my own, in that I moved from a dispensational premillennial eschatology to a historic premillennial eschatology, and that was really based on two factors. Number one, re-examining these passages, these so-called proof texts for the pre-tribulation rapture, and seeing that they were not very good arguments at all for a pre-tribulation rapture. That this view was I just do not think it can be substantiated through Scripture. And this other idea of the separation of Israel and the church, this hardline dichotomy that is held by classic dispensationalists regarding the separation of Israel and the church. And so once I looked at Scripture and became unconvinced of those two ideas, I moved from a dispensational premillennial view to a historic premillennial view. So during this time, I read other books on eschatology. Kim Riddlebarger's book, A Case for Amillennialism, Sam Storm's book, Kingdom Come. Sam Storms is also an amillennial. And Storms actually presents, I think, a very good argument against the premillennial view, which I'm going to go over in a future video. But I then moved from a historic premillennial viewpoint to an amillennial view regarding eschatology, and that's where I am now. I hold to amillennialism. So in future videos, I want to present an argument against premillennialism, and this will largely be based on Sam Storm's argument in his book, Kingdom Come. And then I also want to examine the so-called proof texts for the pre-tribulation rapture. Many of these verses and texts that are put forward in popular writings and by popular speakers, and I want to give a response to those and show why those texts do not support a pre-tribulation rapture and why I became less and less convinced of that doctrine.